The Missouri Ozarks in 1902 was a land that seemed untouched by time. Rolling green hills wrapped in fog each morning, tall oak and pine trees whispering secrets in the wind, and small wooden cabins scattered across the valleys like forgotten toys. The people who lived there were quiet folk. They worked hard, prayed harder, and kept to themselves. In those parts, neighbors could live a mile apart and still hear the echo of a gunshot or a scream carried by the cold night air. Life was slow, simple, and sometimes cruel. At the edge of one of those valleys stood a cabin surrounded by thick forest, so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The place had always carried a kind of heaviness about it, a feeling that made travelers hurry their horses when passing by. The locals called that stretch Weller Woods, though most avoided saying the name after dark. The man who lived there, Thomas Weller, was known to some as a recluse, to others as a man burdened by tragedy. But there were whispers too, stories told by children in hushed voices about strange noises in the night, and the shadow of a man watching from the trees. Before anyone called him a monster, Thomas was just another man trying to survive the roughness of Ozark life. He had inherited the land from his father, a hard man who'd built the cabin with his own hands and raised Thomas to fear God more than anything else. When his parents died of fever, Thomas stayed alone on the property. He worked as a trapper, sometimes selling pelts to traders who rode through town. He wasn't cruel or unfriendly, just quiet, withdrawn, the kind of man who avoided small talk but would help if someone asked. Town of Ash Grove, about 10 miles south, barely noticed him most of the time. But they noticed his wife, Clara. She was a bright-eyed woman, younger than him by nearly 15 years, with hair the color of wheat and a voice that softened even the grumpiest shopkeeper. People often wondered how someone like her ended up with someone like Thomas. She'd come from a small family in Springfield, and when she married him, most assumed she wanted to escape the noise of the city for a simple life in the country. No one questioned it then. For a while their life seemed peaceful. They had a small garden, a couple of goats, and a dog that barked at everything. But even in the stillness there were cracks. Clara was seen less and less in town after that first year. Some said Thomas kept her home out of jealousy, that he didn't like other men looking at her. Others believed she grew sickly, though no doctor ever came to visit. When the storekeeper asked about her, Thomas only said she was resting. He said it every time. The forest around their cabin held an odd silence, especially at night. People swore they heard things, low moans, strange cries. A hunter once claimed he saw Thomas dragging something heavy toward the woods under the light of a lantern. Another said he found one of Thomas's traps filled with bones too big for any animal. But no one dared confront him. Out there, a man's business was his own. Still, unease lingered. Even before anything terrible happened, there was something in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The preacher once mentioned in his sermon that evil didn't always wear a devil's face. Sometimes it lived quietly among decent people, hidden behind a polite nod or a closed door. After that, some folks began locking their doors at night, though they couldn't quite explain why. In town, life went on as usual. Children played by the river, men traded tobacco and gossip, and women met at the church to sew and share stories. But now and then, someone would glance toward the hills where Thomas lived and grow quiet. It wasn't fear exactly, just the sense that something out there was wrong, though no one could say what. A traveling salesman who stayed overnight in the area told a story that spread fast. He said that as he rode past Weller Woods at dusk, he saw a figure standing by the tree line. The man's clothes were torn, his face pale like chalk. He didn't move or speak, just watched him ride by. The salesman swore that even after he turned the bend, he could feel the man's eyes following him. Inside that cabin, Thomas sat by the fire most nights, staring into the flames long after they had dimmed. The dog would whine softly, sometimes packing, growling at nothing. Clara's rocking chair sat empty by the window, the wood still creaking as if remembering her touch. No one could have known what was coming. No one imagined that by the end of that year, the quiet woods would turn into a place people whispered about for generations. But looking back, the signs were all there. The isolation, the silence, the way Thomas's eyes seemed to carry something broken and buried deep. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't born out of rage or evil. They're shaped by loneliness, by grief that festers until it becomes something else. And in those dark woods of Missouri, that loneliness was about to tear a man's life and an entire community apart. The winter of 1902 came early to the Ozarks that year. Frost clung to the windows of the Weller cabin like thin white fingers, and the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls made the nights stretch endlessly. Thomas had grown quieter, though no one thought that possible. His visits to town had become rare, and when he did come, he barely spoke a word. He looked older than his years, his beard unkempt, his eyes sunken and restless. People said grief could hollow a man out, but the truth was, no one really knew what ate at Thomas Weller from the inside. Clara hadn't been seen in months. The women in town whispered about it when the men weren't listening. Some thought she'd gone to visit her kin in Springfield. Others said she'd run away, tired of the loneliness and the heavy silence that hung over her life with Thomas. But the ones who knew the woods best, the hunters, the trappers, they told a different story. They said she was still there, that if you walked near the Weller property at night, you could hear a woman's voice calling faintly through the trees. Thomas never spoke of her, not once. When asked, he only said she was unwell. But people noticed how he started buying twice as much meat from the butcher and stopped buying bread entirely. They noticed the bruise on his neck one morning, shaped like a hand. No one dared ask. In those parts, folks believed it was best not to pry into a man's home life, especially one who lived as far out as Thomas. As the months dragged on, his behavior grew stranger. He began carving things from wood, figures, faces, animals. At first it seemed harmless, something to fill the long hours, but the carvings turned darker. One boy said he saw them hanging from the trees like ornaments, small figures bound with twine, faces twisted as if in pain. When the preacher's son mentioned it to his father, the old man told him not to talk nonsense. Yet even he locked his door that night. The isolation had started to change Thomas. He no longer shaved, barely slept, and spent hours talking to himself. The neighbors who passed by sometimes saw him standing in the yard, staring into the woods like he was waiting for something or someone to come out. When he did speak to the few traders who came by, his words were scattered, confused. He'd talk about shadows that moved where no light reached, about hearing Clara's voice whispering his name from the darkness. "She doesn't forgive easily," he once told a peddler before walking back into his cabin. The man rode off fast after that. In town, the sheriff began to get questions. People wanted to know if Thomas's wife was alive. But there was no law against staying home, no proof of wrongdoing, and besides, folks in those hills didn't take kindly to interference. The sheriff rode out once, mostly to quiet the gossip. He found Thomas splitting wood in the yard. The man looked worn but calm, almost polite. Inside the cabin, the sheriff said the air smelled strange, something like mold and iron. He noticed the floorboards near the fireplace looked freshly replaced. When he asked about Clara, Thomas said she was sleeping. The sheriff didn't press it. He left uneasy, though, and when he reached town again, he said only, "Let that man be." But the quiet couldn't last forever. That spring, Thomas's younger brother, Henry, returned from working on the railroad. Henry was the opposite of Thomas, charming, handsome, and easy to talk to. When he came to visit, the two hadn't spoken in years. The reunion was stiff at first, but the brothers shared the same blood, the same memories of their parents, the same land. Henry planned to stay a few weeks, help with repairs, and maybe hunt together like they used to. For a while, things seemed to calm. The two men chopped wood, fished the nearby creek, and shared whiskey by the fire. But Henry began to ask questions about Clara. He hadn't seen her since before he left for St. Louis. Thomas dodged the questions, his voice tightening each time. Henry noticed how his brother never entered the bedroom, how the door stayed locked at all hours. He also noticed the smell, sweet and rotting, seeping through the cracks of the floorboards. Then one night, Henry said he saw something that made his blood run cold. He'd gone outside for air and noticed Thomas standing in the moonlight near the garden, digging. The sound of the shovel was slow and heavy. Henry called out to him, but Thomas didn't answer. When he got closer, he saw that the hole was too wide for planting and too deep for storage. He asked what it was for, and Thomas just said, "Best not ask." His eyes glinted, empty but certain. The next day, Henry packed his things and left, saying he'd visit again in the summer. He never did. Months later, when asked, he told people he couldn't explain what he'd felt in that cabin, only that something there was deeply wrong. After Henry's visit, Thomas's grip on reality seemed to slip completely. He stopped going to town at all. Children said they saw strange fires in the woods at night. The butcher's son claimed he saw Thomas kneeling near the creek, talking softly to something that wasn't there. When the preacher tried to pay a visit, he found the path blocked by fallen branches and bones strung up in trees. He turned back before reaching the house. Meanwhile, the town began facing its own troubles. The mills were shutting down, money was tight, and people were looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes. Whispers about Thomas turned into anger. The men at the tavern began saying someone needed to check on him proper. They called him strange, dangerous, unholy. The word monster was spoken more than once, and soon, that was the name people used without hesitation. But behind that name was still a man, broken, grieving, trapped in his own mind. Those who once pitied him now feared him. The tragedy was that Thomas didn't see himself as dangerous. In his mind, he was keeping something sacred, holding on to Clara in the only way he knew how. The forest had become his sanctuary and his prison. He spoke to her every night, convinced she still answered. He told her about the townsfolk, how they'd turned against him, how they didn't understand. Sometimes, he said, he could hear her crying, begging him not to let them take her away. When summer came, a group of men from town decided to confront him. They said they were going to sort it out, though none could say what that meant. They carried lanterns, axes, and rifles, their faces tight with fear and righteousness. As they made their way up the hill, the woods seemed alive, branches snapping, wind howling through the pines. Some turned back uneasy, the others pressed on. What they found at the edge of Thomas's clearing would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The smell was thick and sickening. The trees around the cabin were marked with strange carvings, and the door hung open. Inside, the fire was still burning, though no one tended it. On the table lay a woman's dress, faded and folded neatly beside a plate of untouched food. Thomas wasn't there. But there was something else, a faint humming, almost like a lullaby drifting from below the floorboards. One of the men swore he heard two voices. Another said it was just the wind. None of them stayed long enough to find out. By the time the sheriff returned the next morning, the cabin was empty. Thomas Weller had vanished into the forest that had shaped and destroyed him. From that day on, no one dared to set foot in those woods again after dark. The people of Ash Grove spoke of him as if he were something more than human, something cursed. But those who truly knew what loneliness could do to a man whispered a different truth, that the real monster was Thomas himself, but the pain he carried and the silence that let it grow. And as the years passed, travelers still said that when the moon was full and the wind moved just right, you could hear the echo of a man calling softly through the trees, searching for something he'd already lost. The night it happened, the air felt heavier than usual, thick, like it was pressing against the walls of the Weller cabin. A storm was brewing over the Ozark Hills, the kind that rolled in with no warning and made the ground tremble with thunder. Thomas sat by the fire, staring into it as if waiting for something to come out of the flames. His hands shook slightly, not from the cold but from the noise inside his head. The whispers, the memories, the voice that sounded so much like Clara's, it made his chest ache. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, sometimes gentle, sometimes angry, sometimes just staring at him in silence. He'd talk to her softly, the way he used to when they first married, but there was never an answer anymore. Only that faint echo in his mind telling him she was still there, waiting for him to set things right. That evening the lantern flickered low as wind rattled the cabin door. Rain started tapping against the windows, soft at first, then harder, until it sounded like the sky itself was breaking apart. Thomas rose from his chair, walked to the small table where Clara's things were laid out, a comb, a small silver ring, and a lock of her hair tied with ribbon. He touched each one like they were holy objects, his breath shaking. He whispered, "You shouldn't have gone," his voice raw, trembling. "You shouldn't have left me." But she hadn't left, at least not in the way the world thought. Clara lay in the small room behind the locked door, the one no one had entered since the sheriff's visit. Her body was frail now, her skin pale as wax, her eyes forever closed. Thomas couldn't bear to bury her. He told himself she'd wake up one day if he just kept her close, if he kept talking to her. But that night the air in the cabin changed. It was colder somehow, and he could swear he heard her breathing again. He lit another lantern and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, rot and damp wood. Still, he didn't flinch. He walked to the bed and sat beside her, brushing the hair from her face. "You look tired," he said softly. "You always looked so tired." He thought he saw her move, a twitch in her fingers, a shift in her chest. His breath caught. He leaned closer, eyes wide. "Clara," he whispered, "you're back." The storm roared outside, lightning flashing through the window. For a moment it seemed like she opened her eyes. Maybe it was the lightning, or maybe his mind had finally broken, but he saw it, her eyes wide open, staring right at him. His heart pounded so hard he could barely breathe. He reached for her hand, but it was stiff and cold. Still, he smiled. "You came back to me," he said, his voice breaking into a laugh that sounded half like a sob. "You forgive me." But then the voice in his head, the one that had grown louder these past months, turned sharp and angry. "She doesn't forgive you. She never did." Thomas froze. He stood up suddenly, knocking the lantern to the floor. Fire spread across the boards for a moment before dying under the weight of the damp air. His chest heaved. He looked at her again, but now her face wasn't peaceful, it looked accusing, like she was staring through him, blaming him. The sound of rain against the roof grew violent. The thunder rolled like a growl. He shouted then at her, at himself, at the storm. "I did everything for you," he cried. "You left me here, you made me like this." He grabbed the edge of the blanket and pulled it away, his breath ragged, his mind unraveling. He stumbled backward, tripping over the chair, crashing to the floor. His hands clawed at his head as if trying to silence the noise. "Stop it! Stop talking to me!" he screamed. "You're not her." Something snapped inside him, a breaking point. He grabbed the shovel leaning by the door, the one he'd used weeks ago to dig that strange hole in the yard. He raised it above his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'll make it quiet," he whispered. "I'll make it all quiet." And with one trembling motion, he brought it down. The sound was dull, sickening, and final. The thunder swallowed it whole, as if the storm itself didn't want to hear what he'd done. He stood there shaking, the shovel slipping from his hands. For a moment there was silence. Then a sob, raw and animal, tore from his throat. He dropped to his knees beside her, clutching her lifeless body, rocking back and forth like a child. "I didn't mean it," he whispered again and again. "I just wanted you to stay." The storm began to fade. The air grew still, heavy with smoke from the lantern and the faint metallic scent of blood. Thomas sat there for hours, unmoving. When morning came, the light through the window made everything look too real. The room smelled of death and guilt. His hands were stained red, his face streaked with tears and ash. That was when he noticed something, her hand, reaching out from beneath the blanket. It looked almost gentle, as if she were forgiving him after all. He pressed his forehead to it, shaking. "I'll fix it," he said softly. "I'll make it right this time." He dragged the body outside just as the fog began to roll in. The ground was soft from the night's rain, easy to dig. He didn't bury her far, just enough to hide her from the eyes of others, but close enough that he could still visit. When it was done, he stood over the mound, breathing hard, whispering a prayer that made no sense. But as he turned to go back inside, he thought he heard her again, her voice, faint but clear, carried by the wind. "You can't hide me, Thomas." He froze. The sound came again from behind him this time. He spun around, searching the trees, his heart pounding. Nothing, just the sound of the forest settling after the storm. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. The woods that had once felt like home now seemed alive with eyes and whispers. The guilt pressed against his chest, heavy and unrelenting. He stumbled back into the cabin, shut the door, and bolted it. Then he sat down by the fire again, staring into the flames. He told himself it was over, that she was at peace now, but the fire crackled and the voice came again, softer this time, almost kind. "You'll never be rid of me." Thomas began to laugh then, quietly at first, then louder, until it turned into something wild and hollow. The sound echoed through the woods long after the laughter stopped. By the time the townspeople came weeks later, drawn by the smoke and the smell, they found the shovel still lying in the yard and the ground freshly turned. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a single lantern burning low and the sound of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. Thomas Weller was gone. Some said he'd drowned himself in the river out of guilt. Others swore he'd gone mad and wandered into the forest to live among the ghosts. But those who passed near Weller Woods after dark said they heard his voice still, murmuring softly to someone no one else could see. And sometimes, if the wind blew just right, they swore they heard another voice answering back. The discovery came slowly, like a sickness spreading through the town. It started with a smell, sweet, heavy wrong, that drifted down from the woods whenever the wind shifted north. Hunters complained first, then the mill workers who cut through the forest to save time walking home. No one wanted to say what they thought it might be. It wasn't until a boy named Jesse, chasing his dog too far up the ridge, came running back pale and trembling that people finally went to see for themselves. What they found was quite horror. The cabin was still standing, but it looked abandoned for years. The windows were broken, the roof sagging under fallen branches, and the air around it felt different, thick, almost humming. The men who entered said the smell inside nearly made them retch. The bed was overturned, and the walls were marked with what looked like scratches, deep and frantic. On the table sat 2 tin plates, each holding a dried crust of bread. In the corner, someone had carved words into the wood, "She's still here." Behind the cabin, the earth was disturbed. The sheriff and 2 others dug there, not speaking, their faces tight with dread. When the shovel struck something soft, the sound made them stop cold. They uncovered what they expected but hoped not to find: Clara Weller's body, her dress faded, her hair still tied with the same ribbon she'd worn to church once long ago. No one said a word for a long time. The sheriff, an old man with more years in the field than anyone, took off his hat and crossed himself. "God help him," he muttered. "God help that poor man." The news spread through Ash Grove like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew. The women wept for Clara, remembering how kind she'd been when she'd first arrived, how she'd smiled at strangers, how she'd sung in church, how her laughter used to carry through the hills. The men shook their heads and spoke in low voices about Thomas. Some called him a beast. Others, after a drink or two, said they pitied him. The preacher said both were true. Henry Weller came back when he heard. He arrived 3 days later, riding hard through the rain. When he reached the cabin, he didn't speak to anyone. He walked straight to the back, knelt by the grave, and stayed there until dark. When he returned to town, he looked hollow, like a man who'd left something of himself behind in those woods. "I should have done something," he told the sheriff that night. "When I was here before, I saw things, I knew something wasn't right, but I left." The sheriff didn't answer. He just poured Henry a glass of whiskey and said, "You weren't the only one." For weeks, the town couldn't stop talking about it. Some said Thomas had gone mad from grief. Others claimed he'd always been dangerous, that his quietness hid something broken. The preacher used his next sermon to remind everyone that evil often wears the face of sorrow and that pity can sometimes blind a person to sin. The church was packed that Sunday. Everyone wanted to believe there was a reason for what had happened, that the madness in those woods was something rare and far away, not something that could ever touch them. But guilt settled over the town like a fog. The shopkeeper remembered how Thomas used to buy things for Clara, sugar, thread, little ribbons, and how one day he stopped asking for any of it. The butcher's wife said she'd once seen bruises on Clara's arms and told herself it was none of her business. The preacher's son couldn't stop thinking about the time he'd laughed when the other boys called Thomas a ghost. No one felt innocent anymore. The sheriff organized a search for Thomas that lasted nearly 2 weeks. They combed through the hills, calling his name, though none of them truly wanted him to answer. Dogs picked up his scent near the creek, but it ended there. They found a boot, a torn coat, and what looked like a page from a Bible, waterlogged and unreadable. Some thought he drowned himself. Others said the woods took him. When the search ended, the sheriff ordered the cabin burned down. "No good will come from leaving it standing," he said. The flames rose high that night, orange and angry, lighting up the trees around it. People watched from the ridge in silence. When it was over, only ashes remained. After that, no one went near Weller Woods again. Even the bravest hunters took the long way around. At night, the town grew quieter. Windows stayed locked, and the church bells seemed to ring more slowly. Some claimed they saw Thomas's shadow wandering through the trees. Others said they heard Clara singing softly by the creek. Most dismissed it as stories, but the fear lingered all the same. Henry stayed in town for a while, settling his brother's affairs. He sold the land to a man from Springfield who never once set foot on it. Then he left for good, heading west. People said he never married, never settled. He just drifted, carrying the memory of that place wherever he went. Sometimes in his letters to an old friend, he wrote about Thomas, not with anger, but with sorrow. "He wasn't evil," he wrote once, "just broken in a way no one could fix." Years later, children in Ash Grove would still whisper about the monster of the forest. They'd dare each other to walk up the ridge at night to see if they could hear him calling Clara's name. But their parents would pull them inside before sunset, saying softly, "Don't play near there. Some places never stop grieving." For the townsfolk, life went on, but the story of Thomas and Clara Weller never truly faded. It became something between legend and warning, a tale of love turned to madness, of silence mistaken for peace. Whenever someone mentioned it in the tavern, voices would lower, eyes would shift toward the window facing the woods. Even decades later, old-timers swore that on still nights, when fog covered the hills, you could see the faint outline of a man standing by the ashes of his old home, head bowed, as if still waiting for forgiveness that would never come. And maybe that was the cruelest part of it all, not the crime itself, but what lingered after. The emptiness, the guilt, the endless question that haunted everyone who'd ever known Thomas Weller, whether he was a monster by choice or just a man the world forgot how to save. Years passed, and the story of Thomas Weller became less a memory and more a legend, a caution whispered between generations in the Ozarks. The forest reclaimed what it could. Grass grew over the burned cabin site, the creek ran clear again, and the wind that once carried cries now only stirred the leaves. Yet no matter how much time passed, the shadow of what had happened never left the land. It lived in the soil, in the silence, in the uneasy feeling that something about the story had never truly ended. There were no trials, no sentences, no justice in the way people usually understand it. Thomas had vanished before anyone could hold him accountable. The sheriff filed the case as missing, presumed dead, though in his heart he doubted death had taken Thomas in any ordinary way. Clara's remains were buried behind the church in town, in a small grave marked only by a wooden cross. People brought flowers for a while, then stopped. But the grave stayed clean, untouched by weeds, as if the earth itself showed her mercy. Henry Weller never returned to Missouri. He sent money every year to keep Clara's grave tended, but asked never to be contacted again. His life became a quiet one, built on guilt and distance. He worked odd jobs in small towns, never staying long, always carrying the weight of that cabin on his shoulders. Those who met him said he spoke little, drank often, and sometimes woke at night calling his brother's name. The sheriff, long retired, died believing he had failed both of them. He once said to the preacher, "I should have gone back sooner, should have opened that door." But the preacher, older now too, could only shake his head. You can't save a man who's already decided to bury himself. In the end, no one could say for certain what made Thomas Weller snap. Was it grief that turned him mad, or guilt long before Clara's death? Maybe it was both, a sadness that grew too big for his mind to hold, spilling out in ways no one could predict. The people of Ash Grove learned something hard in the wake of it all, that evil doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from pain, from silence, from the kind of loneliness that eats away at reason. After the tragedy, neighbors started looking at one another differently. They began checking in on the quiet ones, the widows, the recluses who kept to themselves in the hills. The preacher's wife started a church circle for those living alone, bringing food and company once a week. The sheriff's successor made it law to investigate missing persons, no matter how far out they lived. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Still, the story left deeper scars than anyone wanted to admit. It forced people to question their own beliefs about love, faith, and the thin line between sanity and madness. Clara's death became a symbol, not of evil, but of neglect. A reminder that behind every closed door, behind every quiet life, there could be suffering no one sees. There was no newspaper coverage, no photographers or headlines. The world beyond Ash Grove never heard of the monster of the forest. But for those who lived there, the story became something sacred, spoken carefully, as if saying too much might awaken the ghosts again. Parents told their children about Thomas not to frighten them, but to warn them. Never ignore pain, never turn away from someone just because they seem different. In time, people stopped calling him a monster. They began calling him the Lost Man of Weller Woods. The name felt softer, more human. Some even prayed for him, believing that maybe, somewhere in those endless woods, he'd found the peace that had eluded him in life. The years turned into decades. The forest grew thick again, and new families settled nearby, unaware of what had happened there long ago. But every once in a while, someone would find something, an old buckle, a rusted lantern, a piece of wood carved into the shape of a woman's face. Small reminders of a story the earth hadn't forgotten. If there was a lesson buried in the tragedy, it wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about the cost of silence. The people who had once pitied Thomas from afar realized too late that pity without compassion is useless. They saw how isolation could twist grief into madness, how love could turn to possession, and how pride could keep a man from seeking help until it was far too late. Justice never came in the way it should have. No handcuffs, no courtroom, no redemption. But in another way, maybe justice was already done. Thomas had been left to face his crime alone, swallowed by the same wilderness that had once been his refuge. The woods became his judge, his prison, and perhaps in some strange mercy, his grave. And though the story faded with time, the questions it left behind never did. What drives a person to such darkness? Is it born in them, or does the world plant it there, one disappointment at a time? Was Thomas truly evil, or simply a man undone by sorrow too heavy to bear? No one ever found the answers. They only found echoes, faint traces of a life that began with love and ended in ruin. In the end, the tale of Thomas and Clara Weller was less about horror than it was about humanity. It showed how fragile people can be, how quickly devotion can turn to obsession, and how grief, left untended, can rot the soul like damp wood. It reminded those who heard it that monsters aren't born in the dark. They're made there by years of neglect, loneliness, and silence. When the last of the old-timers who remembered them died, a new family built a home near the edge of what used to be Weller Woods. They found it peaceful there, the air cool, the land quiet. But sometimes, on certain nights when the fog crept down the hills, they said they could hear a man's voice in the distance, faint but steady, calling a name only the trees seemed to understand. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was a memory, or maybe it was something else entirely, love, regret, and guilt, still wandering the forest, refusing to rest. Because some stories, no matter how much time passes, don't end. They just sink deeper into the soil, waiting to be remembered.